Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks, covering the latest global news analysis from a Taiwan perspective. I'm Annie Kuo.
I'm Rath Wang. Today we talk about how the U.S. is rounding allies in the region to deter China from invading Taiwan. We also discuss the crucial role of Australia and the Philippines. Let's hear Eli Ratner, the Assistant Secretary for Defense for Indo-Pacific Security Affairs.
Do you think there's any chance that we can make it to the end of the decade without essentially a PRC invasion of Taiwan, without a breakdown in the kind of deterrence that you're talking about? And my answer was yes, I think we do.
Joining us today to discuss is William Stanton, former de facto U.S. ambassador to Taiwan as director of the American Institute in Taiwan and deputy chief of mission in Australia, currently professor of international relations at National Chengchi University. Albert Chiu, professor of political science at Tunghai University. Albert is an expert in international affairs and Taiwanese foreign policy. A warm welcome back to both of you on the show.
We also hear later from military expert Patrick Cronin, Asia-Pacific Security Chair at the Hudson Institute, based in Washington, where President Tsai Ing-wen is due to speak during her U.S. transit this spring, and Professor Jay Batongbakau, Director of the Institute for Maritime Affairs and Law of the Sea at the University of the Philippines. They talk about the U.S. Indo-Pacific defense strategy on integrated deterrence and the Filipino role in a potential Taiwan attack. Let's now talk about integrated deterrence. As we heard from Eli Ratner, the Pentagon's top person for the Indo-Pacific defense, America believes it can deter China well into the next decade. Ambassador, I wanted to ask my first question. How confident are you in the words of the Assistant Secretary?
Well, far be it from me to disagree with the Assistant Secretary of Defense. I mean, he has better insight probably than I do. But it's a relatively optimistic assessment. I mean, we've heard an admiral for the U.S. Navy.
He did say that it won't be easy, though.
He said it won't be easy. That's true.
But he has confidence.
He has confidence. It's been a little bit of a contradiction, but I'm hopeful that it'll be that long and even longer. But you know, there are some people now who estimate that Xi Jinping in 2028 will be in his the last year of his third term as Emperor of China. And it might be at that point that he feels he has to do something. There have also been admirals, one admiral predicted it would be 2027. You know, so there are different estimates out there. I think the important thing is that we not worry about any particular made-up deadlines, but that the U.S. continue to do what it can to strengthen the defense for Taiwan and to continue to build alliances for that. And in that regard, I've been, over the last couple of years, happy about the formation of the Quad with India, Japan, the United States, and Australia, of AUKUS, the Australia, U.S., Japan cooperation. I've been happy to see, and we'll talk about it later, I know, the U.S. efforts to establish new bases in the Philippines, and also the U.S. paying new attention to the Pacific Islands, where China has been making inroads. So I think across the board, there have been very positive developments in building our alliance basically to help defend Taiwan if it comes to that.
Do you feel that the U.S. is doing enough in this sense?
Well, I mean, United States, we have to realize that at the end of the day, whatever public policy or foreign policy it is making towards Taiwan and towards China should be in the interest of the United States. I mean, only if we can to that realization can we make more realistic policy about ourselves. So personally, I don't always look forward to the United States' arrival of military or more immediate weaponry assistance to Taiwan.
Right.
But for me, I will ask myself and also our nation that what we are supposed to do at this point of time, and you know, our preparation is good enough. If not, and what else we can improve on? I think that's the first priority.
Although it'd be good to have the support, though. Do you feel that the U.S. is supporting Taiwan in the way that it can?
Of course. I mean, the United States, like what I said, at its interest, it's the best choice to support Taiwan. But support could be taken in different forms, right?
Right, yeah.
Could be in a material way or in a spiritual way. But the last thing we want to have is that because United States is still a democracy, where, for example, in Washington you got a bunch of politicians from Democrats or Republican. The last thing we want is only lip service from them. What we want is something material. Yeah.
I think you're right about that. I mean, the most recent example is the candidate for the Republican nomination to be president, DeSantis, just came out and said that, what's going on in Ukraine is just a territorial dispute between Russia and Ukraine. And I think that's totally wrong. There are a lot of other candidates and also powerful Republicans who have disagreed with that, that there's a lot more at stake. But there are a lot of people for political or other reasons who might say, well, that's not really in our best interest, so we can move away from it. But right now, I think I'm pretty confident that things are moving all in the right direction for Taiwan, particularly because Taiwan, as Ukraine did in the case of Russian invasion, Taiwan itself is making bigger efforts.
Right, but as we say that the U.S. is still really concentrated in helping Ukraine at this moment of time, right? Do you think Taiwan can also get all the helps and needs and weapons that it needs in time at this point of time?
That's hard to say because I don't know what the logistics strain is. Actually, there are some weapons that still Ukraine is waiting for that have already been promised but not delivered. And there are also weapon systems they want that the U.S. has not yet agreed to deliver. So it's hard to say, but overall, I think the fact that it's saying when President Tsai has decided to extend conscription, the fact that it now has 70% support among the Taiwan public, it seems to prefigure a new attitude towards the defense of Taiwan. So I think there's going to be a greater interest in helping. We also see now that 3 to and maybe 5 nuclear submarines, from Great Britain, the United States will be participating in that effort. So the nuclear submarines are not because the need to defend Pacific Isles. It's obviously the need to protect against particular developments coming from China. So count me an optimist right now.
Right, but Professor, I would also like to ask, because as we're seeing here, if Taiwan, with a higher percentage of probably more than 60 or 70%, like what Ambassador has just previously mentioned, if Taiwan can really resist a Chinese takeover, how detrimental do you think it's going to be?
Yeah, well, I mean, like in Taiwan, first of all, we have to understand that without the U.S. assistance, even that's a late assistance, it is hard for us to survive maybe up to 1 month long. But what we can do, what I meant by from the United States in terms of assistance is not only, the direct assistance. Could have been, for example, the way the United States lends supports to Ukraine now.
Yeah.
Right? They can provide us with the weaponry, even the missiles, even the armory, and so on, that kind of way. But if we go without that altogether, then it's hard for us to survive more than 1 month. I think that's, from different types of estimates, that's so more or less a consensus over there. But to us, I think the first thing, like what I said in the first part of my, response is our mentality. And the second is that I think it's naive for us to expect that the arrival of the U.S. military assistance will be in time. So we have to prepare for the worst. And with that, the conscription is returned. I think that part is good. And also what kind of military weapons that we are having in our stockpile is insufficient. We should purchase more of them from the United States, or maybe we have to kind of reform to overhaul our military training program. For example, some people in the past that talk about singing songs in the military is not necessary because that's only like symbolic. But some other generals in our military do not agree with that.
Well, like you said earlier, mentality definitely plays a very important role over here. It's 2023, so we're looking at 2024 presidential election here in Taiwan. How do you think this may also be a very important and critical role in what's going to happen to Taiwan?
Okay, first of all, I think the DPP hopeful, the William Lai, pretty much is on the spot already, ready for this. On the KMT side, it's still hard to foresee. Even though some people say, Hou You-yi, right, the current New Taipei mayor, he's gonna be the one. But like in the internal factional fights within KMT, it's hard to speculate who's gonna be in the position representative of KMT. But anyway, I think even let's think in this way. Even Hou You-yi got elected at the end of the election, still he has to face the pressure from China. It's not like, because KMT candidates got elected, so the Chinese government, the CCP, will ease the pressure on Taiwan in terms of unifying Taiwan. Still, we have to face the reality that they take a step-by-step action plan to take over Taiwan. And the plan for them is not democracy, it's one country, two systems. There's no question about that.
Ambassador, I wanted to go back to you. In terms of Taiwan has this, like Professor mentioned, the KMT, this defeatist mentality. How do you deal with that? You've been in many countries in the Asia Pacific. How do other countries deal with this kind of infiltration or mental,
Well, it's about the worst I've seen, really. Because Taiwan faces more of a challenge than other Asian countries where I've lived or I've visited. And I worry, certainly, there's not going to be an invasion or an attack or any change until after the presidential elections here, because the PRC clearly hopes for a Kuomintang victory. If the KMT wins, then they sort of feel like everything will fall into place with one country, two systems. But that's kind of depressing for me, because if there are still people within the Kuomintang who believe that one country, two systems is a workable formula after what they've seen happen in Hong Kong, after they were seeing what happened originally in Inner Mongolia, where now students have to speak in Chinese in many of their classes, after what you've seen in Tibet, what you've seen in Xinjiang, people who would say, it'll be different for Taiwan is just a fable. And so it's hard for me. They're very intelligent people, obviously, in the KMT. How they can hold on to this idea that the way forward is to make peace with China. It's just an invitation to come and say, take over. So I'm very distressed by the lack of evolution in the thinking within the Kuomintang from what I can see. I'm hearing the same things I heard back in the days of when Ma Ying-jeou was president. So there hasn't been much development there.
Professor, how do you feel this can be solved? How do you feel Taiwanese people can stand up and not have this defeatist mentality?
Okay, first of all, let us kind of put our feet in the shoe of KMTers. It's undeniable that peace is everybody, who wants. I mean, peace is important, right? But not only Taiwan, but also the United States wants peace with China. But the thing is, the Chinese government, now the CCP, what they want in their own action plan is not in line with the mainstream idea in the world. It's not in a democratic, open, transparent government, as much as the Prime Minister Australia said that Australia is a transparent government, but but Chinese government is not. So we all want peace. But the thing is that it will be naive for us to just in a hurry to jump into the negotiation table and talk about what's the next for the future of Taiwan without considering the intents of their the contents of their plan. So that will make some of the people look naive in Taiwan to just go straight and talk about the possibility for the future of Taiwan, even if that's something like similar to one country, two system. That's some of what the ambassador said was very important. Some of the KMTers, they really think in that way, and that's not good for the Taiwanese society, since we have worked so hard to develop this democracy for several decades, and now want to bring us back to the original points. That's the no.
So do you feel it's speaking up, talking more about why this is not making sense for Taiwan?
Well, speaking up not only towards our own people, but
Because
also
we're a free
towards the
society, we
CCP,
can't just
right?
go ban them. Or...
Sure. Yeah, we don't want to ban those statements that one country, two system is bad, is good. That's certainly the freedom of speech. We cannot do that. But what we can do is that this is a opinion market where we kind of project a diversity of opinions that we can talk to each other, so that make the discussion would develop in a more like sound way or more healthy way.
So in short, I believe that there's a lot more discussions to be discussed, but just by putting ourselves in a negotiation table probably is not the best thing for us to really think about right now.
It is not for the time being.
So we just talked about a concept of integrated deterrence and how the U.S. is rallying allies in the region to make China think twice before invading Taiwan. Now, coming up next, military expert Patrick Cronin speaks to Rath about the latest developments in that strategy. Cronin recently hosted and interviewed Eli Ratner on Indo-Pacific security.
Patrick, can you share what the current U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy is? I believe you hosted an event with Eli Ratner, the Assistant Secretary for Defense for Indo-Pacific Security Affairs.
Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Security Affairs, Eli Ratner, and Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, Lindsay Ford, who covers South and Southeast Asia in the Pentagon, were hosted by me and Rebecca Heinrichs at Hudson Institute the other day. But the highlights for me were that both Eli and Lindsay stressing integrated deterrence, stressing the lattice work of allies and partners that they're building up, so that you have this three levels of activity. One of them is national strengthening. The second is bilateral sort of strengthening. And the third one is sort of the minilateral and multilateral dimensions of this, not just involving the U.S., but often it's countries like Japan working with others, or India or Australia working with others, with or without the United States. It's an impressive array of measures that have been boosted by the Pentagon in recent months in terms of announcements. This week, you have the Australia, UK, US announcement after 18 months of studying how to proceed with a nuclear-powered submarine and high technology for Australia, working with the UK and the US. There's a plan now for the submarines that's very ambitious.
How do you feel the role of the Philippines and Japan will come in terms of deterring China?
What's happened in the Philippines in terms of announcing 4 new access sites for the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, while that still has to be worked through in terms of domestic politics and vetting inside the Philippines, it's clear that all of these new facilities will be around the northern main island of Luzon, around the South China Sea. In other words, around the potential flashpoints with China, including the southern approaches to any Taiwan contingency. What Japan's been doing in terms of announcing its own defense transformation, very much boosted by China's assertiveness, but also Russia's aggression against Ukraine, is very impressive what the Kishida administration is doing. Korea, Japan making a rapprochement now in strengthening not only bilateral ties, but trilateral ties is almost earth-shattering if it can be fully implemented. And even if not fully implemented, it's still an impressive forward progress being pushed by Seoul with Tokyo support and definitely with Washington support. What the Quad is doing in terms of high technology in India, thinking about the Indian Ocean and strengthening that sort of linkage in the Indo-Pacific is also very impressive. So there's no shortage of developments building on this, again, lattice work of allies and partners, building on the concept of integrated deterrence, by which the Pentagon usually stresses 2 things. One of them is first, just integrating especially the new domains of space and cyberspace and electromagnetic warfare into our own command and control. And that's sort of personified by the joint all domain command and control emphasis within the Pentagon. And then it's really integrating allies and partners in a way that we've not done in the past.
What's behind this urge to boost allies and partners and, as you mentioned, integrated deterrence in the past few months?
It's a growing concern that China might use force, either to enforce a blockade against Taiwan or to actually use even more assertive measures to, for instance, seize an offshore island, or otherwise just resort to greater coercive action around China's periphery. So deterring Chinese aggression is the main driver of U.S. Indo-Pacific policy right now in the short term. The long term, it's still very much oriented toward technological competition. But because there is this growing concern that in this decade, China could miscalculate, could decide that this is the moment to unify Taiwan, something that Xi Jinping emphasized as recently as today. And, that is what is driving the need for the Pentagon to show that even while it supports Ukraine's effort for self-defense against Russian aggression, the Indo-Pacific is the primary theater, China is the pacing threat, and deterring conflict in the first place.
In your conversations with the Assistant Secretary, how confident is the Pentagon and the U.S. on deterring China from a Taiwan invasion?
Well, you can read in the papers that there is a range of views from both uniformed officers and civilians working in the Pentagon or around the Pentagon. But I must say, Eli Ratner talks a very strong, confident game. I think Undersecretary Colin Cole, Deputy Secretary Kath Hicks, and the Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin all uniformly are quite confident that they are doing what is necessary and sufficient to keep deterring China's aggression. But you do see comments from Indo-PACOM, Admiral Aquilino, for instance, as well as some of the generals like General Minahan, who was reprimanded, in fact, for predicting conflict in the next couple of years. Taking it's not that it's lacking confidence, but it's more wary about what China might do still in the short term during their tour of duty. And that's understandable because, someone like Admiral Aquilino is there for a few years in charge of that command. He wants to make sure that deterrence on his watch, not the next watch, is stopped. Whereas the Office of the Secretary of Defense is working not just for the short term, but also thinking longer term about how deterrence can be pushed well into the next decade. And indeed, Dr. Ratner stressed the fact that he really does think they are doing what's necessary to deter conflict from happening in the Indo-Pacific in this decade.
Let's now talk about Australia. The Sydney Morning Herald and other Australian headlines have reported that China could invade Taiwan as early as 2026. Ambassador, how do you feel in that invasion of Taiwan, Australia could get pulled in?
Well, I think it might well be pulled in, at least to some extent. It depends on what you're talking about. I mean, the Australians, when I was the charge in Australia, the Australians would always remind me that they'd always join the U.S. forces in any war.
So would you see boots on the ground? Would you see that?
But I don't see the Australians doing that. I mean, my older daughter who lives in Australia with an Australian wife, an Australian husband, and I have a granddaughter there. There seems to be a disinclination to get involved in that, but they will have to be involved in a certain sense because almost certainly the South China Sea will become involved, the Pacific Islands may become involved, the first and second island chains, and also Australia may feel the necessity, at least from afar, now that it's going to have nuclear submarines, it's going to have other advanced weapons, including missiles. It may feel that it has to play some role, or it could be that the United States will ask it to play a role. I don't know what then the decision will be. But the Australians have never, when put to it, avoided, just said, no, we're going to be pacifists, we're going to sit this one out. In the past, this might be a change.
Right.
But also the feelings these days in Australia towards China, the blush is off the rose because once the Chinese imposed sanctions on imports of wine, on imports of produce, there was a lot of backlash. Now, Albanese, who came in as a new Labour Prime Minister, he clearly was set on improving the relationship with China. But I don't see that that's really gone very far. I think there's such a basic difference between any country that's diplomatic that doesn't share the same values with China and their own economic interests. There's always a contradiction. And the U.S. has faced the same problem. In America, there were many people who were keen to have good relations with China because they were making money there. But that didn't mean we had the same values on human rights, the same values on intellectual property protection, the same values on almost anything. So I think that's a dilemma that the Australians will face.
Right, and for geographical reasons, ambassadors talked about the Pacific Island nations, right? So Professor, I would like to ask you, as we're seeing recently, especially, China has been courting the Pacific Island nations more and more. So how do you think, at this point of time, do you think Australia is doing enough to make sure that China do not take a further measure on this?
All right, kind of as a quick response to Ambassador Stanton's statements that Australia joined the United States military action. There were several historical examples there, including in Iraq and a lot of peacemaking actions there. So I believe that if there's a war, outbreak in Taiwan, it's very likely for Australia to get involved, but not in the first scenario.
Right.
Maybe when the war kind of spilled over to other areas, for example, tracking Japan and even Philippines, and even the Pacific Island nations, then
right.
that would be part of it. Okay, that's number one. Number two is that I think the foreign minister, the Penny Wong, the current minister of Australia, she visited the island of Fiji 9 months ago. He actually promised to respect the Pacific priorities and institutions as she set out and implicit contrast with China. And we all know that the Chinese government, the CCP, did a lot, invested a lot of resources, even money, trying to bind out those island nations from that area, which is a threatening message and send a signal to Australia government that you guys have to keep up good work and keep investing more in resources in this area, so that you don't want to see the Chinese, the PLA, build up a lot of military bases in that region. That's kind of against Australia.
Are there any kind of conflicts or tensions going on between Australia and the Pacific Island nations right now that's pretty evident?
Right. In the past, in the previous administration, I think the Australian government really ignored the importance of the Oceania nations in that, countries in this area. Number one, they were in poverty. A lot of people are still under this poverty line that they need a lot of material supports. And China sees this as much as China sees this in Africa, right? So China has a role in that, but Australia government in the past kind of neglects that needs over there. Number two is that in the Oceania area, you see countries where there's a dictatorship out there. A lot of them are kind of bothered by this problem of the dictatorship, where they also put down dissent domestically. They don't want people to enjoy the freedom of speech. Like what Ambassador just mentioned, that the Australia governments, maybe they thought that the lifestyle in Australia and also in these Pacific Island nations are inconsistent, and that's why they kind of skip the needs over there. But that's wrong. Like what China used in other nations, that we really have to put our feet in their shoes and to walk for another 10 miles and to feel how they feel. And to use their way to think about their own problem. So I think that's also the lesson for Australia governments to pick up.
How successful do you feel Australia is, Ambassador?
Well, I wouldn't overestimate Chinese advances in Oceania. I wouldn't, because they're having the same problem worldwide, also in Africa, Latin America, South Asia, that all these countries now are deeply indebted to China. China has given all these loans.
Right.
And now it's a credit trap, because China wants to get something out of it. And these countries, the money seems to disappear, doesn't benefit them that much. And they want more, and often they're going back to China to get more money. It's an endless sort of, it's a well that they throw money into, and they often don't get a return on it. So by the same token, these Pacific Island nations, they are often disappointed. There was a recent report, I forget which island it was, unfortunately, but where the prime minister complained that where he went, he was followed by Chinese agents on his own island, the Chinese had not lived up to their commitments, that there were huge problems. And so I think it's not an easy road for the Chinese either. And I think in a way now for the first time, Pacific Islands feel like they can play it to maximum advantage to get what they can from China, get what they can from Australia and New Zealand, get what they can from the United States.
In the end, who do you think is going to win? Do you think they'll come over with democratic values and free societies without spies that you mentioned?
I think it's going to be split. I think some people will be more inclined to, I just saw Samoa, for example, had not participated in some conference.
But this area is crucial to Taiwan's defense. I mean, if Australia were to support Taiwan, it would have to go through the Pacific Islands.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, let's hope the Australians are persuasive. I just don't know.
And going back to defense, for you, Professor, do you feel that China would actually do a preemptive attack on Australia with the number of bases increasing there, and they are talks about nuclear weapons in Australia?
Right. I think to me, the Chinese government has a plan consists of two steps. One is that they want to take over Taiwan. That's for sure. If that goal is achieved, they would take one step further to expand the power of the military invasion, even including Japan and even the Pacific Island nations. They want
to take Taiwan, do you think they'll do that? They'll actually strike ahead Australia and Japan so that they can easily take Taiwan?
I don't think so. I think they would take Taiwan over first because that's more realistic and it's more achievable. Okay, and one thing I do want to remind is that there's recent news about this Pacific Island nation called Micronesia, right? And it was reported that the Micronesia might shift the tie from China to Taiwan, but not for free. they want money from us, right?
It was $50 million.
Right, $50 million like that. So as a realist, I'm not that naive that we don't need to invest material supports in them. We still have to do that. So that's like a hybrid of material supports and also the ideal, not the propaganda, but try to convince them that democracy is better, openness is better for their society to grow. So we have to have the hybrid.
So in addition to the investment that you were talking about, maybe in the future, what other cooperations do you see right now that we can do with all these nations and also with the U.S. allies to counter China?
First of all, in terms of economic scale or the finance assistance scale, it's hard for us to be comparable to China. But what we can do is that we got a lot of advanced technology and also the agriculture skill and the experience we had with our forest and so on. We can kind of transfer those information to them. And in fact, in the past, when KMT was still in power, a lot of African countries that need this from Taiwan. So we can work on this and try to help them with this. Not necessarily about money, but we have personnel, we have information, we have education we can offer them. I think that's the way to go.
In December, actually, the United States, Australia, and Japan already announced, for example, as a way of helping the Pacific Island nations, that they were going to fund the construction of an underground cable that would allow fast internet service to Nauru, Kiribati, Micronesia. And also, Blinken went to Fiji himself. I was surprised by that in February. So I think there's already been activity where, it's not only Australia, but the United States and also Japan. And we haven't really mentioned Japan, but I think Japan's the most likely country, aside maybe from the United States, that would want to get involved in the event of a conflict in Taiwan, because as they've said, I think Yoshida, the prime minister, said, if something happens in Taiwan, something's happening in Japan as well. They're very worried because if Taiwan is taken, in a sense, Japan is isolated.
Ambassador, I wanted to go back to the submarines. Do you feel that will actually be used in a Taiwan conflict?
Well, it depends. These submarines take a long while to get built. So it depends on when the conflict comes.
But if they are built and it's in Australia, you think they'll send them over?
I think they would be willing to, yeah. I think that's much more likely than boots on the ground. There's also, the other naval vessels with missiles. Who knows what would happen? But I don't want to speak for the Australians.
Right, and especially with the headlines saying Taiwan could be invaded as early as 2026, probably. not that possible for them to be involved. And we just talked about the role of Australia and U.S.-led integrated deterrence of Chinese expansionism. Now, coming up next, Professor Jay Baton-Bakal speaks to RAF about a potential role the Philippines could play in the event of a Taiwan contingency.
Jay, there seems to be more activity between the Philippines and the U.S. Can you talk a bit about recent developments?
The announcement by both the Philippines and the United States that they are now resuming the implementation of a 2014 agreement known as the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Arrangement. Okay, this agreement, or the EDCA, as it's usually referred to, was forged during the Aquino administration. And it was at the time directly in response to China's expanding activities and assertion in the South China Sea and West Philippine Sea. So this was a way for the Philippines to get the U.S. to establish what they call a rotational presence in the Philippines. The EDCA was intended to help the Philippines enhance its maritime domain awareness and external defense capability. So, unfortunately, however, during the Duterte administration, implementation of this agreement was suspended because of Duterte's closeness to China and his attempts to bring the Philippines to the Chinese camp. Okay. With the Marcos administration, however, things have turned around, and now the Philippines and the United States are implementing EDCA again, no? With a little bit of urgency and haste, probably because of the United States basically being concerned about the developments in the region since 2014, basically. In 2014, if you recall, China did not yet have these military bases all across the South China Sea. And also at the time, relations over Taiwan had not yet been as tense as they have been in recent years. And also, relations between China and the U.S. had not yet gone as far down, and so we're seeing the fruits of that of these steps, these efforts to get back on track with the alliance.
How concerned is the Philippines in terms of what could happen in Taiwan? And you mentioned,
I think, is a subject of debate internally. For the United States, definitely, access to the Philippines and use of Philippine bases is a necessity, because we are, after all, the closest neighbor of Taiwan. They're just about an hour and a half away from Manila, by plane. So that gives you an idea of how close it is, and definitely the Philippines could play a major role in supporting U.S. operations if they are needed, to address some kind of Taiwan contingency. On the Philippine side, however, historically, I think the problem has been that the Philippines has not seen itself as an important player, in any geopolitical movement. So it has always seen itself merely as a host of U.S. bases, and has not really put as much attention towards issues such as external defense and its possible role in regional stability, by hosting U.S. bases at the time, back in the 70s, and now as well. So I'm sure that the Taiwan contingency, a Taiwan situation, is foremost among the minds of policymakers and decision makers. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they have already a united or consistent view about things.
Let's now talk about the Philippines. The country had agreed to let U.S. troops access 4 more bases. These are mainly in the north, near Taiwan. The total is now 9. Professor, Both Taiwan and the Philippines belong to the first island chain. Can you talk a bit about what the first island chain is?
Sure. The first island chain refers to the first chain of major Pacific archipelagos out from the East Asian continental mainland coast. It's composed of the Korea Islands, the Japanese archipelago, the Ryukyu Islands, Taiwan, and finally the North Philippines, hence extending all the way from the Kamchatka Peninsula in the northeast to the Malay Peninsula in the southwest.
Why is it so significant?
Well, actually, it serves as a first line or chain, if you will, to contain China, not only in wartime, but also in peacetime. For example, if we want to have a business ship or cargo ship to going through the straits or the waters near this area, if China is able to control the whole area, then it's really subject to their dominance and also their rule and how they're gonna play with it. And also, in the first island chain, that's very important to the second island chain, where Guam, the U.S. territories over there, to protect China from further invasion. If unfortunately China takes over Taiwan, then the next step they are going to do is to attack Guam and even Hawaii, even the mainland America.
So, Ambassador, do you feel that if Taiwan is taken, the U.S. loses the first island chain?
Well, it's certainly at risk. The problem is for all those countries of East Asia, including China, but also Korea, including Japan, it's like 1/3 of the world's commerce, I believe, goes through
So
that
as the professor
channel.
said, trade.
Yeah, trade
peacetime.
and energy. All the energy comes down through the goes through the Malacca Strait and then goes up the South China Sea. So that whole area is crucial, critical for both commerce, but also for energy supply. So if it were controlled by China, that would be a huge problem for not only the U.S., but for our allies in Northeast Asia.
So do you feel the U.S. is determined to protect the first island chain?
I think so. I think that's one of the reasons the U.S. is also determined to protect Taiwan as part of the island chain, aside from our own interest in protecting and preserving a flourishing democracy, which has made enormous progress in the world. It's, I don't know, last year I think it was our 9th largest, it might be the 11th, it varies from year to year, trading partner of the United States. It's, it's I think 20th or 21st in the world with GDP.
And you got chips.
And yeah, we get our chips from Taiwan. So, it's an important country for the United States.
And speaking of which, we talked about the relationship between the U.S. and the Philippines right now, how important first island chain, especially Philippines is also part of it, is important to the U.S. And it's also very important because they renewed the enhanced defense cooperation arrangement in 2014. So Ambassador, in your opinion, how important is that?
It is important, of course, that, it's preserving what had already been there, but re-emphasizing it. It's the same way that, recently in the Congress, there was a bipartisan commission, temporary one because it was a select committee. A committee, but it's bipartisan, that's what's important, and its basic purpose is to re-emphasize our support for this region of the world. Our support for Taiwan is particularly focused on Taiwan, but Taiwan is sort of the linchpin, I think, for the whole region, from the U.S. perspective and from the perspective of other democracies. So yeah, it's, whether it's a bipartisan commission or it's renewal of a previous agreement, all of these things are very important.
So it would definitely help improve and enhance deterrence for, let's say, Chinese invention to Taiwan.
I think so, yeah.
And I also wanted to take a look at our current president here in the Philippines. He's very different from Duterte, the previous president. How do you think this may also affect Philippines, Professor?
Philippines, if you look at the history, the political history of the Philippines, you tend to find that it's linger between pro-United States and against China and pro-China against the United States.
It's very extreme.
Right, and which is more like a parallel to the Korean politics. And now the Marcos, right, the Bongbong Marcos, now he's like willing to cooperate with the United States. First of all, he led, like what you just mentioned, the further build up of the military infrastructure in Philippines. That's ever since like several decades ago. So that's a breakthrough for the U.S. Army to build up a infrastructure over there in the case of a war with Taiwan, and if they want to do something to China, that's really a good start point. Okay, that's number one. Number two is that just because of the nature of the Filipino politics, that's kind of swing back and forth. It's important for us to remember not to put all the eggs in the same basket, right? We have to get prepared, not only Taiwan, but also the United States, that what if there's another government comes in and take the power as the ruling party over there. So maybe if they kind of swing back to China, what gonna be the preparation we have? But one thing important is that infrastructure remains, even the regime, the ruling party comes and go. So as long as we can have that kind of infrastructure built up over there, and the running cost, the startup cost is gonna be high, but after it's in operation, it's gonna be going down. So that means that the chances of those infrastructure to remain is very likely. So that's, I think we will think of the changing government and how that's gonna impact the U.S.-Filipino relations and also the Taiwan-Filipino relations.
And as we're saying right now, U.S.-Filipino relation is definitely improving from the past. And also, as we can see, mentality right here in Taiwan, we're also very pro-U.S. And we're also all on the first island chain. So let's, for instance, say, China invade one of the neighbor countries. How do you think this may also prompt or also have this cooperation among these first island nations?
Right. As I just mentioned, I think if there's ever a war breakout in this region, I think Taiwan will be the first target. It's very unfortunate for us as a Taiwanese to speculate. But that's also is to suggest that the war is not going to be contained only within the territory of Taiwan, because there's a spillover effects to Japan, to Philippines, and even to Australia. So when the United States, if the great nation decides to step in to help Taiwan in whatever forms, from a more direct military ground troops deployments, or even to a more indirect help assistance like what they did to Australia. It doesn't matter. Still, you will have all these nations surrounding more or less get engaged, involved in some certain degree.
But how much is making Xi Jinping think twice? Okay, now the U.S. has the Philippines, now it has Japan, all these bases.
I think the major deterrence for Xi Jinping against him from taking in action against Taiwan is that as long as there's any kind of indirect nations getting involved.
We just talked about the latest U.S. global defense strategy and how the Indo-Pacific is its top priority. Let us know in the comments section if you think the U.S. can successfully deter a Chinese invasion. Also, if you like our shows, please subscribe to our YouTube channel at Taiwan Talks 2022.
Thank you for watching our show today. Stay safe and see you all next time.